All right. Hey, hi everyone. Hey, thanks, Ivor, for joining. I'm just
Hey,
going to
Mandar.
give a I'm just going to give a quick introduction and then we'll get rolling. Hi, I'm Mandar. I'm a member and a certified metabolic health coach from D-Life, which is India's first and only award-winning low carb platform. D-Life was founded by Anup Singh in 2014. Anup is a silver medalist from IIT Roorkee and the recipient of the Icons of India Award. And he's also the pioneer of the low carb movement in India with his path breaking protocol of 100-gram carbohydrates per day max, given by him in 2012, which made not only LCHF but even type 2 diabetes reversal possible for Indian vegetarians. And in 2020, D-Life launched the diploma course, which is the only course approved under NSDC partner, the Government of India, in this segment, and the only course with the global biggest 144 hours CPD credit. Anup, along with Shashi, they are the co-organizers of this Metabolic Health Conference, and I'm so thrilled to welcome Ivor Cummins. Ivor, I've been a big fan of you for a long time, and so many of us at D-Life. And I would love to introduce you a little bit for those of you who don't know, though that is getting difficult. So Ivor is a biochemical engineer with 30 plus years of experience in corporate technical leadership. He specializes in complex problem solving, and you can see it in his very critical thinking. He has led large global teams in addressing quite intricate technical challenges. Since about 12, 13 years, he has been focused on researching root causes of modern chronic diseases, particularly CVD, cardiovascular issues, diabetes, obesity. He's also the co-author of Eat Rich, Live Long. And he has some very interesting takes to share, and I'm thrilled to get into the conversation with Ivor. So Anup and I will be your host today, Ivor. Glad to have you
Welcome,
here.
welcome.
Thanks a lot. Great to see you guys. Anoop as well. Goes back a ways.
Yeah, great. So let me kick it off with the first question, which naturally arose. So, what was sort of your red pill moment? Was there a sort of single event which shattered your trust in the mainstream advice, especially around health?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was back in 2012. And put briefly, so I got some routine blood tests, and it's important to note they were routine. They were not special related to any particular problem. So they were blood tests that the doctors, the experts, you would expect would know inside out. At least that's what I would expect as a master technologist in my field. So I got these results. Three of them were really high, serum ferritin, and the cholesterol was quite high, and also GGT, gamma glutamyl transferase, the liver enzyme. And I noted the doctor seemed to be not too bothered and started talking about eating more healthy foods like whole grains and maybe being careful on fat for the cholesterol. And for the other ones, I could see that the expert, the doctor, wasn't really that knowledgeable on them. And I was surprised. So I looked at the numbers and they were way up in the normal distribution, like way outside. So I knew they were meaningful. So I quizzed the doctor on the two key questions you ask when you're brought in to lead a technical team. And you ask, what are the implications of these numbers? And what are the likely root causes that are driving them to be high? And the answer to the two questions was so weak, I was kind of surprised. And I went to another more senior doctor and then a professor of medicine in the family and got a similar result. I mean, they gave some leads with the high ferritin. I could have hemochromatosis, which is more common in Irish genetic backgrounds. But I got a test for that and it was negative. So I just realized, hold on a minute, I better look up what these things mean if the doctors are not really sure on the risk. And I got a shock for ferritin and for GGT particularly. And cholesterol was really muddy. It was harder to see what the risk was. But I went anyway and I said, okay, I'll have to go to ResearchGate and PubMed because I have corporate logons. And I'm going to have to research these metrics, the last 100 years of studies on them, and find out what's going on. So I did that. Within a day or two, I had all the risks, and I could see that cholesterol was ambiguous, so I wasn't worried about that one. But the other two were very kind of portentous or worrying. And then I spent the next couple of weeks at nights and weekends obsessively researching all the metabolic pathways relating to these blood measures. And within a couple of weeks, I realized a few things which did shock me. Talk about red pill. I realized that cholesterol was largely nonsense. And I had found papers that showed clearly cholesterol was a super weak risk factor and very ambiguous. The other two, I found out and discovered a thing called metabolic syndrome, which I'd never heard of, and insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. And it was just like going down the rabbit hole saying, oh my God, how come the doctor doesn't know about this? So, long story short, basically, within a few weeks, I just switched totally to meat, fish, and eggs, and maybe some low starch vegetables because I knew to a certainty that that was the path forward. And within 9 weeks, my bloods were absolutely perfect. I had lost around, I think it was around, God, it's a long time ago. But yeah, I lost nearly 15 kilograms or 35 pounds in 9 weeks, which is a lot because I'd also discovered that eating real food gives you appetite control, which I hadn't had since my 20s. And I began to skip meals for fun. So it was a really life-changing experience. And I went on then to focus on this area of technology, of course.
Oh, quite a quite a ride there. And I think you've been on a very interesting path after that. Uh, so yeah, let me take the
Yeah.
next question as well. So you briefly showed how your background in biochemical engineering also sort of helps you think through some of this. So I'm going to combine two questions, right? So one is, are there some interesting mental frameworks that you use to break down these some of these topics, as well as when you are spotting some of the misinformation? Are there some tells that you are using, which sort of give you a clue that hey, something is off in the reasoning?
Yeah, well, actually, no, that's okay. Two questions. So the methods really are the methods of complex problem solving, which are the same as for critical thinking. So critical thinking and complex problem solving are essentially the same thing, largely same tools. And I giving workshops at the moment on critical thinking, so it's fresh in my mind. So the primary tools I would use are is, not, or some people call it Kepner-Trago, and it's comparative analysis. So you look at a problem and you make a very clear definition. So the problem definition is crucial, and many people don't properly define the problem. And then they end up in total confusion, especially when you're dealing with other people and the problem is not clearly defined. But once you have the problem definition, an is not table is a simple kind of tool that I teach now. And you just put what the problem is and what it might be, but surprisingly is not. And you put that down under what, where, when, and extent, and who. So they're just guidelines to make sure you get all the is and is nots. And you look at the contradictions and the comparison between what the problem is and what it might be, but is not. And that gives a lot of good tips on what might be going on. So it's a really powerful tool. So I'll give an example just completely made up. The coast is eroding. So to get greater clarity, you want to define it better on what it is and is not. So it is the south coast, but is not the east, west, or north coast. Okay. And in extent or timing, it is accelerating since mid 2021 and is not accelerating or is stable before that. So these things can get pretty big, but it's to break down the problem. And if you think about it, when we talk to other people and debate things, it gets very confusing. Okay. It's very hard to keep a lot of facts and comparative analyses in our mind. So the message I have is you must write it down if it's anything other than a trivial problem. But I'll move on quickly. That's the is not. And in the workshop, I did an example of catastrophic climate change. And we worked through with the group. And even the is not tool, it become very clear that this was not what people perceive it as. Another key tool is hypothesis for against table, which I developed mainly around 20 years ago. And you put down your hypothesis clearly, and then you gather the evidence for and against the specific hypothesis. And you draw inferences from the evidence for and against in two columns. And that can be very powerful. And an enhancement is you put in black text evidence that's accepted. You put in blue text any evidence for or against that's not entirely proven out or needs more work. and you put in red the evidence that is particularly powerful, okay, or salient. And these tables can get very big with a complicated problem. But imagine trying to work through it without writing it down. That's what I always tell people. So there are two key tools. In terms of spotting stuff, I have some examples. I don't know if we're going to share slides here, but I have a good example of how you spot these things. But one thing is, if you see an associational study that is epidemiological, and you see the words may, could, or might, right? If you see that, you know it's probably junk science, unfortunately, because this is associational studies. They're full of confounding, which you can never correct for. And at the end of the day, unless there's a odds ratio or a risk ratio of 2 or more, i.e., you're double as likely to have heart disease by eating cranberries or whatever, they're essentially worthless. And I have examples I was going to show, but like a perfect example is the WHO anti-meat program that they ran around 10 years ago. And they came out and declared meat a likely carcinogen and processed meat as a grade 1 carcinogen. I think red meat was grade 2, which is clearly absurd because we evolved on meat, okay? But their ratio, risk ratio in their study was 1.17. And for processed meat, it was 1.18, which are the same. But they declared processed meat a grade 1. Clearly, politically, the decisions were made. 1.17 by Bradford Hill criteria, right, for evidence and proof is absurd. It's a joke. It's almost like it was a comedy, but it was a huge team, thousands of papers analyzed, almost all associational epidemiological claptrap. They cherry picked, and the best they could get was 1.17. So the whole thing should have been thrown in the bin. But it became a massive worldwide media rollout. Right? So that's an example. But I don't want to go on. I'll stop for a moment.
Yeah, so sorry for the glitch. And for those who don't know, our association with Ivor Cummins goes back to, I think, 4 years. First time when you spoke to Indian audience on our channel, right? And so the next question is, I know you're an expert on this, and I've read many of your, early studies long back where you had dissected cholesterol, statin, heart attack, right? And you had, in one of the studies, you had said that statins do not prevent a repeat event, not at all. So now, coming back to the question, the mainstream is still demonizing cholesterol for heart attack, which is the biggest, killer around the world. So is this some agenda, or I would say, corruption or something else?
Well, yeah, absolutely, Mandar. So it's so self-evident now that the whole thing is kind of essentially corrupted that it's kind of amusing in a way. But I do understand that lay people, they have an onslaught of propaganda from the mass media and from the science, which convinces them that it's kind of real. So I often with statins just give one fact that helps people. So, in the British Medical Journal in 2016, for the first time ever, I think, they did a study looking at the pharmaceutical trials for statins and the pharmaceutical data. So, they used their data, you could say the bad guys, pharmaceutical. And they went through all the trials and they wanted to see, well, over around 5 years of taking these statins, which we know have very substantial side effects, often life limiting. Uh, we want to know what's the life extension you can expect, because the perception in the industry is, or when a doctor gives a bag of statins, he or she, the doctor, genuinely believes that they're going to extend life. That's the idea of medication. But the team found actually that the life extension over several years of taking statins daily was 3.2 days to 4.3 days. So 3 or 4 days in pharmaceutical companies' own data of extra life over several years is absurd. It's absurd. I mean, no one would take a drug with side effects for many years to supposedly get a 3-day extension in their life, because 3 days is zero because it's so small, it's just noise. So I think that's the best thing to keep in mind. And the industry went crazy naturally and they wanted it retracted, but it is unretracted to this day because it's true. That answers the question. And you could argue that statins, they have evidence to show a reduction in events or heart events, like heart attacks or revascularizations where you get a stent. The problem is that's soft data because it's subjective. So there's a lot of question marks around the trials as to whether the people who were on the drug were treated differently and followed a different diagnostic path because they were on the drug. Because everyone knows it's unblinded. Because every doctor and person in the trial who should not know who's on the drug versus placebo, they just look at their cholesterol results and they can tell who's on the drug. And then they can psychologically do different treatment or put them into the cath lab or not. So there's huge problems. But you could argue that there's some reduction in events. But the fact that they don't extend life worth a damn, I mean, that should help most people make a decision.
Interesting. Yeah, these low-fat dietary guidelines, they seem sketchy, and but I would love your quick commentary on a bit of history as to how they came in into place altogether. Because as you know, in science, we want to deal with the null hypothesis and having enough evidence to then reject it. So if something is already on shaky ground, we shouldn't be accepting it blindly. So maybe your quick commentary on that.
Yeah, the low fat thing. Well, I suppose Ansel Keys was the primary villain in that pantomime because it is theatre. At this stage, the evidence, even originally when they did it, and since then, over a half century, there is no evidence worthy of the name supporting the low fat concept or hypothesis. So Keys basically did a 6 countries study. He then did a 7 countries study. He associated saturated fat with more heart events, but he picked 7 countries that he knew would give the right correlation. And there were 22 countries he had data for. And if you looked at all 22 countries for saturated fat versus heart disease events, it was just a shotgun plot. There was no correlation. And we know Zoe Harcombe a few years ago showed all the European data gathered over many years. And actually, there's a slightly negative correlation, i.e., higher saturated fat countries, all European data, more saturated fat percentage in the diet, lower heart disease for men and women in huge data sets. So we know it was nonsense. But Keyes, he twisted the rules, he put his thumb on the scale, and he twisted the data to match his belief system at the time. And because he was highly political and extremely aggressive and very cunning, he got himself into the Heart Association. He became a big guru and expert. And anyone else like Professor John Yudkin, who pointed out the obvious, that this was kind of nonsense and that insulin and sugar and glucose were the problem, clearly. He had them destroyed. So he basically used his might of political power from the US to even destroy professors in the United Kingdom. And this is all fully documented. Yudkin ended up in a corner office with cobwebs because that's the way the bad guys do it. So that's kind of the history. So the history is not just in junk science and bad data and manipulation, but it's also an interesting history of using propaganda and psychology and simplistic but untrue ideas to fool people into supporting you. So there's a lot of psychology in there as well, bad psychology.
Yeah, taking that question forward, that second part to that question would be, despite the, evidence of almost an epidemic level of metabolic syndrome issues creeping up from 2020, why isn't any mainstream media, I mean, talking about low carb, high fat diet?
Well, there's a long history there, and I'd highly recommend people to look up Dr. Jay Wortman. and the phrase undoing Atkins. And you should get on YouTube his fantastic lecture in Vail, Colorado. We were up in the ski slopes, and he gave a talk that I always share with people. It's stunning. And he tells the full story of the corruption and industry kind of use of propaganda to destroy the original low carb diets. So the drinking man's diet was one of the first. And yes, the guy said, have a drink or two, which are meals, but it essentially was a low carb diet through and through. In fact, I believe Jay's lecture was so amazing. So maybe you can share the link with everyone after. But I bought an original copy of the book because I wanted to have it. That man who made that diet, it was so successful because it was low carb and people were losing so much weight and looking great that he made a lot of money and fame very quickly. And then the industry and academia came out and basically said he was murdering people. And it went all over the American media that this would kill people. It was mass murder. So think of the psychology and propaganda, mass murder. And his mother rang him and told him about it. She was crying, and his whole thing collapsed overnight. So that was one of the first examples. Industry has all the money and power and access to the media and advertising. So if industry doesn't like a diet because it goes against their interests, or even if academia sees a diet that goes against their advice, they get together and they coalesce and they put together a program. And it's happened again and again and again. And that's essentially it. And it's never stopped. So I have a picture in one of my slides here, and it shows keto crotch. And it was a great example in 2019. All across the media, all across the world, like stunning. A story came out with no basis about women and odors, and that keto might cause odors. Complete made up nonsense, right? Went across all the media within a day or two across the whole world. That's power. So we have millions of examples of that. Programs are put in place against diets or practices that go against food industry profits or pharma industry profits. And the problem here is not only do we have big food, most powerful lobbyist almost in the world, whose interests are being damaged by low carb, obviously, and eating real food. It's a big problem for them. We have big pharma who know damn well at the top that the bad food is causing all the chronic diseases. That is their whole revenue model, like antihypertensives, statins. So now we got the two biggest industries almost in the world. But we've also got academia. And because academia has been wrong for 50 years, they will guard their correctness with their lives. That's the way academics are. They will hold on to a false hypothesis for dear life because they never want to allow that they were wrong for decades. So now we've got these three amazing forces joined together, two mega industries and pretty much the whole of nutritional science, most of it, all joined together in unison behind a goal to maintain the status quo. That's why it's so hard to counter. You're up against the big boys.
Yes.
True, true. So you talked about the very, very inner benefit, quote unquote, of 3-4 days from lowering the cholesterol. Could you also a little bit talk on the side effects, and then despite these side effects, the harms, it seems to be growing. It's becoming a, whatever, billion-dollar industry, right? So who is really benefiting? I know you have sort of half answered that already, but maybe a little more on what the side effects are, as well as blaming this fat, blaming this meat. How do you tie this together?
Well, yeah. So tying things together, usually these things, call them conspiracies because they are. Conspiracy just comes from the words conspire, which means to breathe together. So conspiracy is just when powerful people quietly and not very much in the public eye get together in their own interests and roll out strategies. So most of the conspiracy theories we hear about, they're actually just conspiracies. obviously. But there's usually a two-hander. So you have to push your propaganda for your product or what you do want. And you also, very importantly, have to spend energy and effort on fighting against the competing notion. So the food industry pushes its junk, and pharma does, and they also invest in key opinion leaders and academics to attack the competition. And the competition in our world is a low carb, real foods, healthy diet that gives no money to pharma or food. So it's a two-hander. But your question, I'll just check again. Oh, the statin side effects. So statin side effects are suppressed incredibly, and Dr. Asim Malhotra has done a lot of great work on this. The bottom line is probably, it's hard to say because of the falsification in the data, probably 20+% of people have some degree of side effect, and probably 1 or 2% have severe side effects like muscle pain. I personally know, just in my personal network, not my online or worldwide network, just my personal friends and relations, have 2 or 3 stories of catastrophic statin side effects, to the point when they gave them up, the quote was they got their life back. I mean, over a period of weeks and months, going from healthy, fit, and walking to literally having pains all over the muscles. So the statins shut off the mevalonate pathway, a particular branch, and that branch makes geranyl, which makes a lot of the hormones and things that are crucial for muscle health. So it's unsurprising that statins cause a problem. It cuts off the cholesterol, which is crucial for life and neurologically. So we know all the mechanisms, and there are published papers listing all of the mechanisms of statin side effects and what they will cause. Okay. And we know from real life experience and data that the side effects are manifest. I spoke in November at the Keto Brain Health Conference in Manchester, and my topic was statin side effects. That's what they asked me to cover. So I covered multiple published papers. One good one looked at older people in nursing homes, and they basically did a great experiment. They had their cognitive scores, and then they took them all off the statin just for a few weeks or a month, and they saw a great improvement in cognitive score. And then they did the magical engineering thing that they should do. They put them back on the statin, and they saw the cognitive score come back down again. So it was a perfect demonstration that these are a problem neurologically, and the only problem is we haven't done the work to quantify it properly. But industry will never allow that work. And in fact, one last point, that study specifically said they had huge difficulty in running the study because they could not find doctors or academics who would partake in the study if it involved taking people off their statin. So this is the problem. If you create a big enough falsehood and you maintain it for long enough, it becomes dogma. And then it's very hard to get funding or support to challenge a dogma, because everyone's interests, right, in the mass majority involved in this thing, their interests are in not having it challenged. So it's tough. It's tough.
Anup, you're on mute, Anup.
Oh, I thought it was me.
Yeah.
Yeah, no problem.
One interesting question, where we need your expertise, expert opinion on this recent fad of plant-based diet. That is one part of the question. And the next part is who is benefiting from this ultra-processed plant-based diet?
Yeah, the plant-based thing is kind of crazy. Um, so I can't recall now who it was. Belinda Fetka, Gary Fetka's wife. I
Yes.
interviewed in Mallorca back in 16. And that's another one worth looking up. Belinda Fetka, Ivor, whatever, you'll find it, meat. And she gave a fascinating history that she researched. And there's a huge religious ideological problem going back to the early 1900s and Harvey Kellogg and the Adventist Church. And I hadn't realized the Adventist Church has become enormous and they're tax-free, even though they run food production companies because they're a religion. So they have delivered an incredible amount of propaganda ideologically over the last century. So that's one thing. But also another thing is that the plant-based people are driven ideologically, like the church, and they make sure, generally, compared to a normal person, that they get into places of influence because they believe religiously about the plant-based or the anti-meat diet. So we find that our academia and our standard setting and food standards kind of businesses and governmental bodies end up kind of stuffed with pro-plant people because they're motivated and they find places where they can influence the conversation, whereas ordinary people just go ahead with their lives. So there's been this build-up of plant-positive people in all of our institutions over many decades. That's another problem. Another problem is the food industry loves plant-based, the processed food industry, because ultra-processed food suits plant-based type diets, because the cheapest materials are seed oils and refined grains, and they give shelf life and they give international high-volume, ultra-processed muck food. So they love plant-based message because it supports their business. So the whole processed food industry likes the message, okay? And then there's a more sinister one, unfortunately. And we've seen Billy Gates, you know, and most people should know by now how bad that person is. But he's pushing fake meat and he's pushing ultra-processed fake breast milk. And he's pushing all of these things. But the World Economic Forum are also pushing all of these things. And the Rockefeller Brothers Fund since the 50s has been pushing all these things. And the UN and the EU and WHO are pushing all this plant-based thing. And unfortunately, that whole nexus is around power and control. It sounds like conspiracy theory, but in reality, it's self-evident. All of these big players push plant-based and they use climate as another excuse. But I think that's around getting people fatter and more stupid and more dependent on corporate supply of ultra-processed food and pharmaceuticals. I think that's a broad strategy to get the ants in the ant farm even more dumbed down and take away the meat that's high nutrient density and makes for strong, you know, critical thinking people, and just get them more and more dumbed down so they're easier to manage in a kind of a world government structure. Sounds kind of funny, but you got to remember the smartest guys at the top of the heap, they think a little differently than the average person, and they've got their ideology and religious zeal for control and domination. And unfortunately, we've seen since 2020 in a massive way how bad that can get.
Yeah. I'm actually going to throw it sort of to both of you because I know, in fact, all three of us are engineers on this call. Is methane from the cows warming the planet? Are we going to be in trouble if we eat too much meat? And why are even people telling us these things?
Yeah,
One by
that's a
one.
tricky that's a tricky one because I mean it's funny, the low carb community have been aware that we were conned on cholesterol and fat for half a century, and yet still many of them believe other things that are similar in nature. So the meat, the US, if you go to sacredcow.info, I think that's the website, they've got a load of infographics on this topic and they're very useful. But you can see clearly that if you got rid of all meat, red meat or meat in the US, you drop your greenhouse gas emissions by a couple of percent. So engineers know that's meaningless, right? And even the IPCC, the climate change panel of the UN, which is Rockefeller, basically, the big oil guys created all that stuff. But anyway, even they'd acknowledge that. but it's being used, the climate is being used in the anti-meat agenda that I described in the last answer. It's the perfect thing because most people still believe the climate catastrophe stuff. So you can use it as a propaganda tool to go after the meat. And that's essentially what's happening. So a couple of % of emissions, and if you got rid of all the meat, you'd have to do a load more agriculture, creating plant-based junk food, which would probably just add the greenhouse gases back in. So the whole thing is self-evidently farcical. But what can I say? I mean, in the critical thinking class, we went through climate change and we did a hypothesis for, against, and an is not analysis, Kepner-Trago. And it was funny because we had everyone who was in the group that came to the workshop, they contributed. And I wrote it all on the board on a big touch screen that I have behind me. And it's so clear when you do a hypothesis for, against, and you look at the evidence, the only solid evidence for a catastrophic problem driven by man-made CO2 is modeling. But we know since Neil Ferguson at March 2020 that how good the modeling is, right? It's junk. And the models, and Professor Coonan, is it Steve Coonan? Professor Coonan has spoken on this at length. He was the science advisor to Obama. He's like a fellow at MIT or Caltech. This is the top of the top. And he said this again and again. He wrote a book on mathematical modeling. And he said again and again, the models are all way more different in their outcome than even the temperature we're talking about. He tries to put it nicely, but he said the models essentially are useless. But remember what I said, the only solid evidence, if you could call it that, for a catastrophic climate change based on man-made CO2 is the modeling. That's all they've got. Everything else as we went through it is circumstantial or quite honestly fraudulent. So this is the problem we have. But again, World Economic Forum said the green industry is going to be a 30 or 40 trillion dollar industry. So remember that the people up the top, all they smell is money from the climate thing and control, sadly, and control.
Yes.
Yeah,
So I'm going to take this chance to throw it to Anup as well. Yeah, because let me just quickly say, Anup is a carnivore. He's an engineer. He's a disruptor. So I'm going to sort of flip the role and ask the same question to Anup. That what about the meat and plant?
Before I answer, I would like to add to what Mandar said. All three of us are engineers, and within engineering also, you are metallurgical engineer, I am metallurgical engineer, Ivor is a biochemical engineer, right? All three of us understand chemical kinetics, chemical thermodynamics much better than all these, calorie in, calorie out pushers, dressed as experts. Now, as far as, as Ivor said, it's all about modeling. Now, if you remember, when COVID struck in India 2020, there was some expert, modeling expert who came in and he predicted few million deaths by August of 2020. Now, when the real data came in, after the, everything, the dust settled down, that expert is nowhere to be found. That's point number one. And point number two is even rice cultivation, generates methane. What do? We stop that? No. So in short, this is the whole thing. As Ivor said, it's all about control. And I would take that a step further. I would say, I call them, popularly the Rockefeller gangsters, combined with all others working around them, so-called deep state, including Bill Gates, Rockefeller gangsters and everyone. They're out for control where humans are just object.
That's it. And it's hard for an average person. I mean, an interesting thing that, Anup, just on the climate thing. So all of my top corporate buddies, I left 6 years ago, but I'm still in contact with many of the top guys, the guys I really respected. I'm talking about the rarefied top in technical and management ability, the best of the best. I'm still networked with them. I also have a new network, Maverick organization, which is worldwide and mainly hedge fund managers and kind of financial people, a lot of wealthy people, makes me feel small. But anyway, super smart people. And I give talks for them. And I've got the best of the best in the low carb massive network, like Dr. Mike Eads or like Jason Fung. Luckily, I'm blessed to have been close to the real top technical guys. And I know it because of my 30-year history. What's the point I'm getting to? All of the top strata of the best technical people that I've come across over the last decades, and they are a rarefied top of the top. Universally, we all agree on what COVID was about, and we all agree on the true nature of climate crisis. And we, of course, agree on cholesterol fat. So I don't like, appeal to authority, but I'm not appealing here to a bunch of professors I know, because a lot of them are wrong about a lot of stuff. It's just interesting that it's not just me when I show confidence in claiming these things that I talk about. I have the benefit, I'm blessed by the benefit of having access to the very top of the top best critical thinkers almost in the world. So I just like people to realize that it's not just me or an up. I know what I just said, and it gives you great hope for the future knowing that.
Right.
So
And
this,
a lot of times we see that. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. No, next question was, big food, big pharma. You already talked about ganging up
Yeah.
together. So now, do you think this climate change is the new kid on the block, trying to, push entire world to be essentially a slave? I would not call it, when you take away freedom of diet, and then there's nothing left essentially. So what's your
Yeah,
opinion on this?
it's a tricky one that now I won't get into it, but central bank digital currency they're pushing for CBDC, that is really scary because if they get that, they can enforce all the other nonsense like climate or COVID. If they get a central bank digital currency, we're truly enslaved. They're pushing hard, but there's a lot of pushback and awareness. On the climate thing, it's a really big play. And I mean, it was funny, a couple of years ago, COVID suddenly dropped off the map and it was all about Ukraine. It was like out with this, in with this. Terrible conflict, but it was funny to watch it happen. Drop COVID, Ukraine. And then someone did an interview with a CNN with a hidden camera, and I think the guy was fired, but he was a senior guy in I think CNN. Uh, it was Veritas organization got a hidden interview back around 2 years ago, and the person asked the guy in a bar, "Hey, this COVID thing's kind of blown over, and Ukraine will probably blow over. What are you guys focusing on next?" And the guy said on hidden camera, he says, "Oh, it's going to be climate change." He says, "Yeah, it's going to be all climate change." And he said, the great thing about climate change is, COVID had an end date at some point, but climate change, we're going to keep going. And that was the word from the top. They got their orders, right? Because the media are all connected into World Economic Forum. They all go to Davos in Switzerland once a year, and they all get what's required for global government. And they go back to CEOs and they make sure the message goes out through all the media. That's the way it works. So climate was flagged, and boy, did we see climate going off the radar back around 2 or 3 years ago. So it's a big one. I don't think it'll really succeed, especially with the changes in America now. You can argue all you want about Trump or Elon, but clearly climate is getting pushed back, and I do see awareness now growing that there's something really stinking about the climate disaster narrative, bit like COVID, bit like the other things. So I do have a hope that enough people will feel that they can discuss it because usually it's censored. You're not allowed to question climate change or you're called a conspiracy theorist. That shut people up for a long time. But I think that's changing. And I think it's getting more acceptable to debate climate. And as you guys well know, if the bad guys have to allow debate, the thing falls apart. So all narratives and propaganda, all of the stuff we touched on in this discussion, it's all nonsense. It just is. So you cannot let people discuss it, or people are not stupid. it'll begin to become apparent that it's nonsense. So they have to censor, and they're trying to get internet censorship now, but that's on the back foot as well. So the attempts to censor the internet, Musk and all, has caused big problems with that strategy. So I just feel it's all to play for, and humanity is going to have to step up to the plate and start speaking our mind. Speak truth to power, speak your mind, you know. Be proud of your critical thinking. If you have a question about what everyone thinks and you have a question on it, say it. Let's all speak up.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you, Ivor. Now we are coming end of the session, and I would request Shashi to come in.
Shashi,
Ivor,
Yeah.
thank you. I think you have been one of the long-term supporter of D-Life for quite a long time, and thank you for accepting this invitation and sharing your
Thank you.
knowledge.
Thank you.
Thank you once again, and I hope we meet again in longer sessions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Delighted to be here. Privilege. And now it's Valentine's Day, so I got to go and look after that.